Hi, my name is Joe Malin, and I'm thrilled to have the chance to talk with you as part of Write the Docs Prague. I'm a senior staff technical writer for Splunk. I work on API documentation for one of Splunk's monitoring products. As part of my responsibilities, I write code examples for our APIs. I have an interesting background as a technical writer. I studied computer science in school and then worked for over 15 years as a software engineer for Silicon Valley companies. I gradually became frustrated with the poor code examples I saw. I found that they were hard to follow and sometimes didn't even work. My frustration led me to switch to technical writing as a way to help people develop software using APIs. I'm here today to talk about writing code examples. To start, I want to share with you my objectives for this presentation. I want you to learn the following ideas as you listen to my presentation. Examples are an important part of documentation. Documentation skills help you plan and implement code examples. Most importantly, you're not an imposter. You can make a contribution. I was listening to a presentation recently when I heard Lorna Mitchell, a developer advocate for Vonage APIs, say, "Examples are worth 1,000 words." I took from that the idea that examples are just like pictures or diagrams. They clarify complex ideas. Imagine trying to put together a piece of furniture without a picture. Imagine trying to make a complex series of commands or API calls without an example. In addition, examples are important because customers ask for them. Companies become successful by listening to their customers. I myself have added code examples specifically in response to a customer request. Examples improve the productivity of your users. Customers can copy and paste examples. This helps them avoid mistakes and produce their product faster. Examples demonstrate your product's value. Customers don't want to read about product features, they want to see them. The way they see them is by following your examples. Let's consider you for a moment. As a technical writer, how do you deal with code examples? That is, even if you agree with me that examples are important, you might still feel like an imposter. You say to yourself, "I don't know how to code. Can I write code examples? What if I make a mistake? Where do I start?" I believe that you're not an imposter. Here's why. Because our examples are important, you need to add them. I hope that this presentation will help you learn how. You don't need to know coding or commands in order to add code examples to your documentation. Your superior documentation skills help you add code examples. I've described why code examples are important. Now I'll show you how to write them with confidence. Before I go too deep, I want to point out the context of my ideas. I'm focusing on code examples for enterprise software because that's where I have most of my recent experience. My observations and code examples cover REST APIs. They're the most popular and widely used APIs today, and I've done a lot of work with them. Even so, my ideas apply to all types of APIs. Please, as you listen to my presentation, apply my ideas to your specific needs. Given that examples are important, how do you use your tech writing skills to plan and implement them? I'll start by discussing planning. The first step is to determine the examples you need by listening to your customers and colleagues. This is a skill you already know because you do it when you gather documentation needs. Prioritize your work. You already do this when you prioritize writing tasks. Gather examples. You already do this when you gather existing internal and external documentation to help you write a topic. Create a style guide for your code examples. Most of you are already familiar with style guides. If you aren't, you can learn more about them from other technical writers. Step 1 in planning is to gather needs by listening. Listen to your customers. My customers continually say, an example would really help here. Listen to customer support. Learn from them the product areas that cause the most confusion. Listen to your field staff. Enterprise software sales engineers are always creating proof of concept demos for prospective customers. Since the goal of these demos is to sign a new customer, they're evidence of customer needs. Developers point out problems that occur when customers use the product incorrectly. I see this with the product I write for. Even as I speak, I'm writing a code example to help customers use the product correctly. All the needs we encounter are important, but which ones do we work on first? I set priorities based on severity and impact. A severe problem is hard to avoid or work around. A problem with widespread impact affects a large number of users. Customer support sees the most severe and widespread problems. Incorrect use impacts everyone. For example, a customer that uses the API incorrectly can slow down everyone using the system. Customer problems can be severe, but they're often specific. Writing an example for just one customer is lower priority. Sales engineers are a good source of examples. Now that you have a prioritized list of examples you need, you can gather existing examples or write new ones. When you write examples, be a tech writer. You know how to organize and present information with clarity, consistency, and accuracy. Use these skills and focus less on writing code. Gather existing examples as your raw material. Convert raw information to useful documentation. Use your tech writing skills to clarify examples, make them consistent, and ensure their accuracy. If you can code, do it, but don't worry about not knowing how to code. Step 4 in your plan is to write a style guide. Most of you are familiar with using style guides with documentation. Using a code example style guide is the same idea. The style guide helps you achieve clarity and consistency in your code examples. To start a style guide, answer these questions for yourself. Which language or languages should I use for my code example? What style guidelines do I want to use? For example, how do I format command line examples or JSON data? What will I use for fictitious information? What values will I use for names, addresses, phone numbers, web domains, and so forth? How do I represent values that users must replace in order to make the example work? To demonstrate the ideas I've shared so far, I'm going to present a real example of planning and implementing code examples. As I plan and implement, I'm going to follow the same steps I presented before. I'm going to gather needs by listening, prioritize my work, gather the examples I need, and write an example style guide. The rest of my presentation is based on an actual API. It's a simple one, and it's open source, so you can experiment with it on your own. The API is called Petstore Plus. It's based on the open source Petstore API hosted at swagger.io. The Petstore API helps customers manage pets in a pet store. My extensions add a token-based way of authenticating requests and the ability to have multiple stores. I'm now going to follow the steps I proposed. To learn the examples I need, I listen. I review customer requests I've received. I talk with customer support to find out the most common areas of confusion. I talk with sales engineers to find the examples they use. I talk with developers to find out about system problems. Following along this real example, I've heard several needs. For example, customers get confused when they send REST API requests. They don't understand that every request needs an authentication token. I'll explain this in a moment. Customer support tells me that customers often get errors because they try to add pets to non-existent stores. My developers tell me that customers are using the wrong API to report store inventory. As a result, the system slows down and every customer is affected. This is how I prioritize these needs. From support, I know that I need an example of adding pets to new stores. From customers, I know that I need an example of getting an authentication token that customers use when they make an API call. From developers, I know that I need an example of using the correct API for reporting inventory. Now I gather examples for the top priority work. From customer support, I get examples of getting an authentication token and using it to add a new store and a pet to that store. Customers need an example of getting an auth token, but I already have that in examples from customer support. I asked the software developers to write an example that demonstrates how to call the inventory API. They agree, but it's going to take some time to finish. I decide to make this low priority. Now I write an example style guide. This is a summary, and I'll point out the details as I go through writing an actual example. Based on feedback I received from the Write the Docs Slack workspace, I chose to present my examples using curl, which is a command line tool for sending URLs. Curl is well known and has a lot of documentation. I am confident that customers will accept curl examples. One line per argument makes curl examples easier to read. When I write examples that have request bodies, I put the request data in a file. The data file name argument option reads the request body from the file named file name. I describe the fictitious names I'll use. This is easier to understand with an actual example, so I'll wait to explain it. I use the form left bracket value dash name right bracket for replaceable values. I'll wait to explain this as well. For JSON, I indent lines by 2 spaces. To summarize, I listened to customers and my colleagues, and I prioritized their needs. I gathered or asked for examples, and I wrote a style guide. Now I want to show you how I used this plan to add a code example. In this section, I'll present the code example I wrote. The example has 3 steps, each of which is a REST request sent using curl. Step 1 is to get an authentication token from the system. I use this token to authenticate the next 2 REST API requests. Step 2, which is the most important one in the example, is adding a new store to the system. This step is important because I know that customers forget to do this when they try to add a pet to a new store. The last step is adding a pet to the store. This is a raw curl command that customer support gave me. It's a straightforward use of curl, so customers who know REST APIs would probably be able to use it. It requests an authentication token from the system based on a customer username and password. My style guide indicates that replaceable parameters must be enclosed in angle brackets, that I've shown in bold, and written in capital letters. The angle brackets indicate to users that they must replace the value with their own value. It also prevents copy-paste mistakes, because the system rejects usernames and passwords that contain angle brackets. The response text from the system contains the HTTP response code 200, which means success, and the message API token, which is the authentication token. In this case, the replaceable parameter format indicates to users that they'll get a value that's unique to them. With the token, I can authenticate the requests I'm going to make in the rest of the example. I won't bother to explain this command. Instead, I want you to see that this might be how you receive code examples that you want. What you see is the raw curl command that I have for creating a new store. It's difficult to read and impossible to understand. Instead of looking at this form of the curl command, let's look at it after I edited it to conform to my style guide. This is the same example after I edited it to conform to my style guide. I highlighted the changes in bold font. Each argument is on its own line. I didn't add the actual token value to the example. Instead, I used the replaceable value API-token enclosed in angle brackets. This is the same replaceable parameter that I showed previously. It indicates to users that they need to replace the value with their own token. It also prevents users from doing a simple copy and paste, because the server will reject an API token that contains angle brackets. I moved all of the JSON data to the add store JSON file. This makes the command easier to read. It also separates the data from the command, which helps users edit the command and the data. For this API request, the response is HTTP response code 200 success, and the message is success. All that I need now is the store data for the request. This is the add store JSON request file, formatted according to my style guide. It's more clear now, and its format will be consistent with the next data file I'm going to use. Each property is on a separate line. Each subproperty is indented 2 spaces. The curly bracket delimiters for a JSON object are on a separate line. So are the bracket delimiters for a JSON array. I underlined the store name to point out that sometimes you can make up names. However, I did check the seed that there's no such town as Anytown, California. The values I highlighted in bold font are examples of using fictitious phone numbers and domains. In the United States, numbers that start with 800-555 or 888-555 are reserved for fictitious use. This is the curl command for adding a pet to a new store. I received it from customer support as I did with the previous one, and it's neither readable nor understandable. You don't have to read it. I'm showing it to emphasize again that you often have to edit the code examples that you gather. This is the command after I edited it. Because I used the formatting specified in my style guide, it looks the same as the previous edited curl commands. This is the contents of the data file for the add pet request. The request data is now in a separate file that's formatted the same way as the request data for adding a new store. In summary, I showed you how to use existing examples to get an authentication token, use it to add a new store, and use it to add a pet to the new store. Based on my style guide, I edited the commands and data for each step to make them clear and consistent. After I finished writing the example steps, I tested them to make sure my entire example worked. An example that contains bugs is worse than no example at all. At the beginning, I said that I gradually became frustrated with the poor code examples I saw. I found that they were hard to follow and sometimes didn't even work. So don't let down your audience. Test your work and test it again each time you change it. This is an example of testing the add store step in a terminal window. Notice that it has a bug. The third line is missing a continuation character / at the end. As written, the command would fail. Although guided learning is an optional part of presenting code examples, it lets you add value by using your writing skills. Guided learning ties together the steps in a code example with explanatory documentation. I highlighted the guided learning documentation I added. The first paragraph explains why customers need to get an authentication token. The second paragraph explains the command in more detail. Here, the highlighted guided learning text emphasizes that users can't add a pet to a new store until they add the store itself. In this slide, I show only part of the JSON file. In some cases, the guided learning text is simply a transition. This guided learning is part of the last step in the example, which is to add a pet to the new store. It starts by providing instructions for creating the request body. The end of the guided learning shows the user how to make the API request to add a pet using curl. By following the guided learning, users learned how to get an authentication for calling APIs, how to add a new store, and how to add a pet to the new store. Guided learning ties together steps in an example. Use guided learning to clarify complex tasks. The example I showed you helps customers avoid mistakes by showing them that adding a pet to a new store is a 3-step process. Provide guided learning in addition to tutorials. Tutorials can be all-encompassing, and customers can get lost trying to follow them. Consider a tutorial that shows customers how to set up an entire system with multiple stores and pets. If customers want to learn how to avoid errors when they add a pet, using the entire tutorial may be confusing. My 3-step guided learning addresses the specific customer problem. I'm going to finish by reviewing what I've shown you. To add the Petstore Plus examples, I listened to customers and my own colleagues to find out their needs for examples. I prioritized the needs. I gathered existing examples from customer support and developers. I created a style guide that helped me edit the examples to make them clear and consistent. Next, I implemented my plan. I edited each raw example step to make it conform to my style guide. I tested each edited example step. I tied the steps together with documentation to make a guided learning. To write good code examples, you need to listen, gather needs, and prioritize the needs. Gather examples and write a style guide to help you make your examples clear and consistent. Edit the examples you've gathered to ensure they follow your style guide. Test examples and tie together your example steps by writing guided learning. Remember, code examples are an important part of documentation. Because you have documentation skills, you can plan and implement code examples. Your documentation skills mean that you're not an imposter. Here are some additional resources, some of which I mentioned. The example I used is based on the Petstore API, which you can find at swagger.io. This URL I show you is for the official curl documentation. The Product is Docs is a book cooperatively written by the Splunk Docs team. 100% of sales are donated to charity, and you can find it on Amazon. The Splunk Style Guide is online and publicly available at the cited URL. Documenting API is a guide for technical writers and engineers is well known in the United States. It's written by Tom Johnson, who's an intelligent and skilled technical writer who works for Amazon on various technical products. Before I finish, I'd like to say thank you to the photographers who contributed images to my presentation. I also want to thank some Splunk doc writers who helped me polish my presentation. They helped me perfect the good parts. The not so good parts are entirely mine. Thank you for listening. If you want to talk with me, look for me in the Write the Docs Slack workspace. My tag there is @JMalin. Please feel free to send me questions and suggestions. My email is jmalin@splunk.com.
Excellent presentation, really.
Thank you very much.
And that is what I want to start this Q&A session with, because people were popping off about how amazing, how great your presentation skills are. So, like, one question said, how did you develop your presentation style? And do you have any resources to recommend for, especially verbal presentation? You spoke in a way that was really accessible to a lot of people, particularly if English isn't your first language. So please tell us anything we can take away.
I've done a lot of work in presentations in various areas, in teaching people ski patrolling and teaching people scuba diving and teaching people skiing in general. And I've given presentations before to professional conferences, and I've spoken in front of people in companies. The best way to develop good presentation habits is to practice, to get up in front of, take the opportunity to do lightning talks and get up in front of people and speak wherever you can. If I always in reviews in peer reviews that I do at my company for engineers, I always tell the managers that they should encourage their engineers to make presentations. You can see that being able to do good stand-up verbal in-person presentations is a skill that really separates you from everybody else. And it's worth cultivating. So
absolutely, yeah. I always ask these questions hoping there's like some secret answer, and of course it is practice, exposure.
I would also have to say that it's a lot of it is practice. I have to say also that I think that I'm pretty quick-witted, so I can think of things as I'm talking and be able to talk without putting in ums and ers and uhs. I saw some of them in the presentation just because it's really difficult to record a presentation remotely and have it all come out perfectly.
Have it feel natural even sometimes. It's like you're talking to a computer.
I feel a lot better giving presentations in person. I've given variations. The other thing I have to point out is that I've given presentations like this, but I've given this presentation before in some forums. And so I had a good understanding of what my topic was. And I've given it live in front of real people. So I've been able to deal with the idea of give and take, and being able to talk about my subject with some authority.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, no one else knows what you're going to talk about better than you. Right. So even if you mess up, it's just,
ignore some of the tricks are ignore things when they mess up, or just, toss them off. Don't get flustered. There's going to every speaker, there's going to be a time when, something really bad goes wrong, like your presentation completely stops, and just be ready to start talking extemporaneously. You should know the topic well enough to be able to cover it. And I think people will accept the fact that the presentation isn't working. So
I just want to add that I think it's especially impressive that you are answering these questions that, for everyone behind the scenes, not, we didn't give him anything before. And you still have the same cadence and lack of ums and uhs. I'm impressed. So thank you. Leading by example. But okay, for the next half of this Q&A, we can actually talk about your talk topic if you want. So we got a lot of questions. I also personally had a lot of questions. Style guides for your code.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. New concept, even though it makes sense when you put it out there. Sounds like it makes sense. So we got a few questions about, for example, like, do you have a way to automate how you check your code for, so that it follows the style guide? Any automation tips in there, practices you do?
I do not have any way of automating it. Automating the style guide is difficult. I think that it's possible. And if you really want to do that, you should talk to your engineers, because they do have ways of what's called linting their code to make sure that it follows a particular style. And they may be able to give you some ideas. I don't do it a lot, but I do check to see that it actually works, which is the important thing. The style is yes, that's great, but the important thing is to make sure that it's working. Having said that, Engineers definitely have a style guide, and they definitely look at it when they do code reviews. So when an engineer submits something to a merge request, say in GitLab, and they may get back comments from other engineers that are doing a review saying, the code looks, the idea looks good, but your formatting needs some work, and here's what you need to do.
Yeah, definitely. And then if we're going to go into the kind of nitty gritty of the code and examples itself, one question we got is, do you have something like a common data set that you should be used within your examples? And I would also personally add, do you have guidelines on, for example, if you have example API requests, should you always use the same API? Should you switch it up? Does it matter? I don't know.
I don't have common data sets. Most of the time I can use data from our product because my product is not just an API, it's also a user interface. And sometimes I get the easiest way for me to do something is construct something in the user interface, then pull it using one of our get APIs so that I have something to start with, tweak it so that it does the example that I want, and then put it back into the user interface so that I could, if necessary, do a screenshot or make sure that it's working correctly. I think in the cases where you're sending lots of data, very strong data oriented APIs, it does make it worthwhile to have a data set set aside, sample data set. And when I get the chance, I've been working on a sample. I've been working on a Python program that generates data that can go into our API. That's a very important thing. Many of our customers want to do a custom, what's called an ingest of data into our system. And to explain how to do that with a large amount of data, you need to have a data set, but very often it needs to be time-oriented. So I have to write a Python program that will generate time stamps for a particular time to make it work correctly.
Yeah.
I see a question that, go ahead, you moderate. I'm not going to hop in there.
I mean, if you want to hop in, that's totally fine.
Somebody said, what if the input data is quite complex with object, with children, etc.? How should you place them in docs? Yes, I've seen that, and I just go ahead and place it. I mean, we do one of the things that you can do is use our API to create what's called a chart of data. Well, this chart has to use data that's already in the system, and a chart object that you send using the API is incredibly complex. I mean, I think they're children of children. So what you do is I use Postman to pull an existing chart that I create in the user interface, update that JSON that I get with the values that I want to use, and then use that JSON as the example that I put into the documentation. It's work, but it explains how charts are done better than anything. As it turns out, we don't have very much demand for creating charts, but we have a lot of demand for what we call detectors, which look at data and send alerts if the data is anomalous. And I do the same thing.
Cool. That all sounds like really great insights for creating your best examples that you can. We had a lot of questions that we're out of time, so that we weren't able to get to, especially about dealing with non-inclusive language or going down the questioning rabbit hole. How can people get in touch with you if they want to know these things?
Absolutely. They can. I am on the Write the Docs workspace. and they can get in touch with me there, direct message. I think my tag is jmalin. They can also send me email at jmalin@splunk.com.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for being here with us today. I learned a lot, and I hope the rest of you all did too.